At my dad's birthday party, my name tag didn't have my name. Instead, it read, "The Disappointment." Stephanie, my stepmother, saw it and burst into laughter. "Well, it's true," she said with a smirk. So I stood up, tapped my glass, and smiled. "I'd like to make a toast," I said, my voice steady, "to the last time you'll ever see me." The room fell into stunned silence. My dad choked on his drink, his face draining of color. But I didn't stick around to watch the fallout. I turned, walked out the door, and left behind the only goodbye he'd ever get from me. I'm 32 years old, and if you asked my father, he'd probably tell you I'm his biggest disappointment. Not because I've broken the law. Not because I'm unemployed. Not because I've done anything wrong. But because I refuse to live my life according to his plan. My father, James, is a man who values three things above all: control, appearances, and family loyalty, as long as that loyalty benefits him. When my parents divorced, I was 10. It wasn't ugly, at least not on the surface. But within a year, my dad had already remarried Stephanie, a woman with 2 kids of her own, Hunter and Olivia. And that's when everything shifted. At first, I really tried. I was just a kid, and like any kid, I wanted my dad to be happy. Stephanie played the role of the perfect stepmom in public, overly cheerful, overly affectionate, always performing for an audience. She'd hug me too tightly and say things like, "I just know we're going to be best friends." But behind closed doors, it was clear she had only one priority: her own children. And my dad? The man who had once been involved in every part of my life? He slowly stopped being my dad and became theirs instead. At first, it was subtle. He missed my soccer games but never Hunter's. Forgot to pick me up from school but was always on time for Olivia's dance recitals. Then it got worse. By the time I was 14, I wasn't just ignored, I was expected to help. Babysitting my step-siblings, doing chores they never had to touch, being the good big sister while they got away with everything. If I ever complained, my dad would sigh like I was exhausting him and say, "They need more attention, sweetheart. You're older, you should understand." But I did understand. I understood that I was slowly being erased from his life. And one day, I would erase him from mine. "You're older, be mature." That was my dad's favorite line. Stephanie, on the other hand, was far more direct. She didn't bother with lectures, she'd just roll her eyes and call me selfish. The final straw? My dad drained the savings account my mom had set up for me, money meant for my college tuition. My mom fought tooth and nail in court to get it back, but by the time the legal battle ended, the damage was done. I was furious. I barely spoke to him my entire senior year of high school. And when I left for college, which I paid for on my own, I never looked back. The only times I returned were for the occasional holiday, and even then, it was out of obligation, not any real desire to see him. Years passed, and our relationship never recovered. I still got invitations to family events, but they always felt more like a box my dad had to check rather than a genuine attempt to reconnect. I knew what he and Stephanie thought of me, the difficult child who refused to play along. Meanwhile, Hunter and Olivia were the golden children, doted on and praised like they could do no wrong. Which brings me to my dad's birthday party. Stephanie had gone all out, throwing him one of those extravagant, invite everyone we've ever met kind of events. I wasn't planning on going, but my aunt, the only family member still in my corner, convinced me. "Just stop by for a little while," she said. "Maybe things have changed." Spoiler, they hadn't. The moment I walked in, I felt it, that familiar, unwelcome tension. People I hadn't seen in years were there, but instead of warm greetings, I got polite nods. Conversations flowed around me, but no one really included me. Across the room, my dad was laughing with old friends, completely at ease. But then his eyes landed on me, and for just a second, half a second, his smile faltered, like he hadn't expected me to actually show up. I was already regretting coming when I noticed a small table near the entrance. Name tags. This was a Stephanie thing. She had done it before, claiming it helped people mingle. Most of the tags were normal. Uncle Mark, Cousin Rachel, Neighbor Tom. Then I saw mine. And I froze. It didn't just have my name. Underneath, in smaller letters, someone had written, "The disappointment." At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of sick joke. A tasteless prank. Maybe a cousin trying to be funny. Maybe a mistake. Then I heard her laugh. Stephanie. I looked up and found her across the room, standing near the bar, wine glass in hand, looking completely at ease. When our eyes met, that slow, satisfied smirk spread across her face. Heat rose in my chest. A few people had started to notice me standing there. A couple of glances flickered in my direction, but no one said anything. Still, I could feel the weight of it. The unspoken expectation. Don't make a scene. I exhaled slowly, forcing my hands to steady. Then, with deliberate care, I set the name tag back down. Smoothed it out. Aligned it perfectly with the others. And in that moment, I almost laughed. Of course she did something like this. This was classic Stephanie, not an outright insult. Nothing obvious enough for anyone to immediately call her out on. Just subtle enough that if I reacted, I would look like the problem. I should have known the second I walked through the door that she'd pull something like this. A hand touched my shoulder. I turned to see my aunt, the only person in this family who had ever truly understood me. Her brows were drawn together, her lips pressed into a tight line. She'd seen the name tag. Her eyes flickered toward Stephanie, then back to me. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I forced a tight smile. "Yeah," I said. "I'm fine." But I wasn't. I was exhausted, not just in the moment, but in a way that had settled deep into my bones over the years. Because this wasn't new. This wasn't even the worst thing Stephanie had done. It was just the latest in a long, calculated effort to remind me of exactly where I stood. I should have walked out right then. I should have turned around, left, and never looked back. But something in me, something that had been quiet for far too long, said no. Not this time. So instead, I took a slow breath, squared my shoulders, and did something I knew would catch them off guard. I smiled. A real, easy, effortless smile. Like nothing had happened at all. Then, without hesitation, I plucked a champagne glass from a passing server, tapped it lightly with my nail, and turned toward the room. If Stephanie wanted a show, I was going to give her one. The soft clink was barely audible over the hum of conversation, but it was just enough. Enough to make a few heads turn. Enough to make Stephanie pause for the briefest second, her wine glass halfway to her lips, eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she tried to gauge my next move. I let the silence stretch longer than necessary, the weight of expectation settling in the air. Then, just as I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, I gave a small shake of my head, like I had considered making a toast and thought better of it. And then I turned away. Not storming off. Not fuming. Just walking away, completely unbothered. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Not yet. The party itself was exactly what I expected, crowded, over the top, polished to the point of sterility. Expensive catering, perfectly curated decorations, everything meticulously arranged for maximum impressiveness. Because for Stephanie, everything was a performance. This wasn't just about celebrating my dad's birthday. It was about showing off, about making sure everyone knew how perfect her life was, how adored she and my father were, how wildly successful their children had become. Their children. Not me. Across the room, Hunter and Olivia were already holding court, basking in the attention like they were royalty. Olivia, ever the polished princess, was surrounded by a small group of relatives, flashing her perfect smile as she twirled a massive diamond ring on her finger. And of course, Dad's paying for everything, she gushed, barely containing her delight. We wanted something tasteful, you know? A real elegant wedding. Not one of those tacky Pinterest disasters. I bit back a laugh. Olivia had always been like this, polished, rehearsed, just the right amount of self-absorbed to ensure that everything revolved around her without seeming too obvious about it. Meanwhile, Hunter was at the bar, nodding along as a few of my dad's old friends clapped him on the back, congratulating him on his new job, which I was certain he hadn't actually earned. Hunter had never worked for anything in his life. Every opportunity had been handed to him. Every mistake quietly cleaned up by my father. And here they were, basking in it. Like it was owed to them. Like they had deserved it. Like I wasn't even there. For a fleeting moment, I considered walking over and sliding into Olivia and Hunter's conversation, just to watch them squirm. But before I could, I heard my father's voice. I turned. He was already making his way toward me, a drink in hand, his expression carefully neutral. "I didn't think you were going to come." I smiled, not a real smile. "Wouldn't miss it." He nodded, glancing around the room before looking back at me. "You've been keeping busy, I hear." There it was. The polite, careful way he avoided actually asking anything about my life. The same way he always did. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice even. "Work's been good. I bought a house last year." His brow lifted slightly. "A house?" "Yep." He took a slow sip of his drink, saying nothing. That was the thing about my dad. He hated when I did anything that made it impossible for him to see me as the failure he'd always imagined I would be. Every success I had, every accomplishment I achieved without his money, without his help, chipped away at the version of me he'd carefully built in his mind. The version of me he could shake his head at. The version he could talk about in pitying tones when people asked about me. I could feel him searching for something to say, some subtle dig to put me back in my place. But before he could, Stephanie's voice sliced through the conversation like a knife. "Well," she said, stepping up beside him, her smile all teeth, "at least she finally did something responsible." And just like that, I felt the heat rise in my chest again. I turned to her. She was beaming, radiating fake warmth, like she was just so happy to see me. But I knew that look. I'd seen it 100 times before. Stephanie was the kind of person who could insult you to your face, and if you reacted, you were the problem. She was just joking. You were too sensitive. I should have walked away. I should have let it go. But I didn't. Because something about this night, about this whole performance, felt different. Maybe it was the name tag. Maybe it was the way my father had barely spoken to me before finding a way to brush me off. Maybe it was the fact that this entire room was filled with people who had never really been my family. Whatever it was, I was done. I turned to Stephanie, tilting my head slightly. "You know," I said, my voice light, I was going to let it go. "But I have to ask. Whose idea was the name tag?" For just a split second, something flickered across her face. I saw it. And she knew I saw it. "Oh, come on," Stephanie said, laughing. "You always take things so personally." It was funny. I nodded. "Right. Hilarious." She shrugged, taking another sip of her wine. "You know, if you spent less time being angry all the time, maybe you'd be," I held up a finger, cutting her off. "Actually," I said, my voice calm. "I think you're right." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "About what?" "About making a joke." I turned slightly, raising my glass. "Because now that I think about it, I have a joke too." She blinked, caught off guard. My father shifted uncomfortably beside her. And then I smiled, slow, easy, deliberate. "I'd like to make a toast." Just like that, the room started to quiet. Not all at once. Not immediately. But conversation began to die down as people turned toward me, curious. Because people love a toast, especially an unexpected one. I could feel my father tense beside me. Stephanie let out a small laugh, shifting her weight like she was trying to brush me off. "Oh, come on, you don't have to," I held up a hand, still smiling. "No, really. I insist." The energy in the room shifted as more people turned my way. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few guests grabbed their drinks, expecting something lighthearted. They had no idea what was coming. Stephanie's smile had tightened at the edges, but she was still playing it cool, still clinging to the belief that I was the same person she'd always known, the person who swallowed every insult, who let things slide, who never really fought back. My dad, though, he wasn't so composed. He knew me better than she did. His grip on his glass tightened, and for the first time all evening, he looked directly at me. Not through me. Not around me. At me. I let the silence stretch, letting the anticipation build before finally raising my glass. To my father, I began, my voice light, almost conversational. And to Stephanie, of course. Because without them, I don't think I would have learned one of the most valuable lessons of my life. I paused, taking a slow sip of my champagne. Stephanie let out a breathy little laugh. Oh boy, here we go. A few people chuckled along, thinking this was just harmless banter. They thought I was about to say something self-deprecating, maybe smooth things over, like I always did. I smiled. No, really. I mean it. Because I think we often learn the most from the people who challenge us. Don't you? I turned my gaze to my father. Dad, you always told me that family is supposed to build each other up. That we should support one another. Celebrate each other's successes. My father's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His grip tightened on his drink. He didn't like where this was going. And I used to believe that. I continued. I really did. But then, somewhere along the way, I realized something. The room was silent now. Stephanie's fingers were curled so tightly around the stem of her wine glass that I half wondered if it would snap. I set my glass down gently on the table beside me. I realized that for some people, support only exists when you fit into the version of yourself they want you to be. A few uneasy shifts in the crowd. People glancing at each other. Olivia looking at my father, waiting for his reaction before deciding how she should feel. Hunter, smirking like this was all just entertainment to him. And Stephanie? She was still smiling. But her knuckles were white. I used to think that if I just proved myself, if I worked hard, if I was successful, if I played by the rules, you'd see me differently. I softened my voice, but my tone remained steady. But I get it now. It was never about me. It was never about what I did or didn't do. Stephanie opened her mouth, probably to cut me off, but I didn't let her. I turned back to my father. Because at the end of the day, I was never supposed to succeed, was I? His expression flickered, just for a second. I let the silence stretch before exhaling slowly, rolling my shoulders back. But I did. The room was still. I built something for myself. I made a life that has nothing to do with this family. And let me tell you, it's been the most peaceful, fulfilling thing I've ever done. I could see it then, the questions forming in their minds, the flickers of doubt, the whispers of curiosity. Because they had no idea what I was talking about. They had spent years believing the version of me that Stephanie and my father had carefully crafted. Not anymore. Stephanie let out a forced laugh, trying to regain control of the room. Oh, come on, this is ridiculous. It's just a name tag. I turned to her, my voice smooth. You're right. It is. But it's also a pattern, a lifetime of moments just like this. Little digs. Little jokes. Little ways of reminding me that no matter what I do, in your eyes, I'll always be the disappointment. My father finally cleared his throat and stepped forward slightly. That's enough. I met his gaze head-on. Oh, I agree. It is enough. And before anyone could process what was happening, I picked up my glass again. I raised it slightly, letting the weight of my next words settle over the room. To the last time you'll ever see me. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. My father stiffened. Stephanie's jaw actually dropped before she snapped it shut. Someone in the back muttered, "Wait. What?" And then, without another word, I set my glass down, turned on my heel, and walked toward the door. I could feel them watching me. I could feel the panic starting to creep in. Because this wasn't like the other times. This wasn't just me getting upset and coming back later. This was final. I glanced back one last time before stepping through the door, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was walking away from a fight. I was walking toward something. Toward freedom. Toward peace. Toward the life I had been building, away from the drama that had always defined this family. As I stepped outside, the cool night air filled my lungs. It was over. I had cut ties the way I should have years ago. No more pretending. No more trying to win approval from people who had only ever cared about me when I fit into their perfect little version of who I was supposed to be. That night, I drove home in silence, feeling lighter with every mile. But even as I sat in my quiet living room, something nagged at me. Had I gone too far? Had I done the right thing? Was I too harsh? The next few days were a blur of texts and calls. I ignored them all. I didn't look at social media, I didn't need to see the fallout. I had walked out of my dad's birthday celebration. I had publicly humiliated him. And Stephanie? She had always tried to push me aside, to craft her perfect little world. Now I had shattered it. The family group chat exploded with messages. I stayed silent. I wasn't ready to face whatever came next. Finally, a text from my aunt came through, the only person who had ever really understood me. "Are you okay?" I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. I was okay, better than I had been in years, but also a little uncertain. I finally wrote back, "I just need some time." She didn't press. The next morning, my father called. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice carrying that same tone it always did, the one that made it clear I had disappointed him. Again. "I'm at home," I said simply. "I'm not coming back." His silence was all the confirmation I needed. "You can't just leave like this," he finally said. "This family, we have to stick together." I didn't even hesitate. Not if sticking together means pretending to be someone I'm not. Not anymore. That was the last time we spoke. Weeks passed. I skipped every family event. Weddings, birthdays, whatever else they tried to organize, I stayed away. The rest of the family either fell in line behind my father and Stephanie or pretended like nothing had happened. I heard through the grapevine that my dad was hurt, that Stephanie was furious, that my brother and sister were disappointed in me for making a scene. But none of it mattered, because for the first time in my life, I was at peace. I was still living my life. I was still thriving. And while I wasn't exactly happy about cutting them off, I didn't regret it either. I haven't spoken to anyone since that night. So now I'm asking, was I the asshole? Was I wrong for walking out like that? For making the toast? For cutting them off completely? Did I take it too far, or was this long overdue? Let me know.